In our headlines on this Friday afternoon, March 31st. Donald Trump becomes the first former U.S. president to face criminal charges after a grand jury in New York votes to indict him amid accusations of bribery on the eve of the 2016 presidential election. Meanwhile, the latest economic findings show a further gain in Korea's industrial output, as well as rebounds in retail sales and facility investment, despite a dramatic drop in semiconductor production. The South Korean capital city is hosting a special exhibition to showcase its support for Busan's bid to host the World EXPO 2030, just ahead of a planned on-site inspection by the International Bureau of Expositions. For the first time in its history, the U.S. is witnessing a former president face criminal charges as a grand jury in New York votes to indict Donald Trump. Jimin has our top story.
Former U.S. President Donald Trump was indicted by a 23-member Manhattan grand jury on Thursday over allegations of hush money payments made in 2016. This comes amidst another run for the White House and claims by Trump that he is completely innocent. The Manhattan investigation is just one of several legal challenges that Trump is facing, and one that Trump has called the greatest witch hunt in history. No former or sitting U.S. president has ever faced criminal charges. The specific charges are not known yet, and the indictment will likely be unsealed by a judge in the coming days. But the 5-year probe was in connection to a $130,000 hush money payment made in the final days of the 2016 campaign to porn star Stormy Daniels for her silence on claims she made of a sexual encounter with Trump, which was logged as legal expenses. The alleged encounter took place in 2006, a year after Trump married his current wife, Melania. The former president's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, has said he coordinated with Trump on the payments to Daniels and a second payment of $150,000 to a second woman, known to be a former Playboy model. Trump has denied having affairs with either woman. Cohen himself has pleaded guilty in 2018 to a campaign finance violation and served more than a year in prison. A spokesman for the Manhattan District Attorney's Office said prosecutors had reached out to Trump's defense team to coordinate a surrender on Friday. A person familiar with the matter said Trump is expected to turn himself in on Tuesday. For security reasons, his booking is expected to be carefully choreographed to avoid crowds inside or outside the courthouse. Jin, Arirang News.
The U.S. remains committed to ridding the Korean Peninsula of nuclear weapons. Now, this is according to Pentagon spokesperson Pat Ryder on Thursday, when asked about the prospects of deploying nuclear weapons to South Korea. He chose to refrain from a direct response and instead said the Pentagon would consult with the U.S. Congress on the matter while continuing talks with South Korea on extended deterrence. He also claimed there was nothing to show on prospects of additional deployment of the anti-missile defense system THAAD to South Korea. Here in Seoul, Foreign Minister Park Jin played host to his Indonesian counterpart Retno Marsudi on this Friday for the 4th Korea-Indonesia Joint Commission meeting. This latest meeting comes as the two countries mark their 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties this year. Accordingly, the two officials touched upon ways to boost bilateral economic activities and to advance peace and prosperity in the Indo-Pacific region. Park praised Indonesia on its productive ASEAN presidency this year and shared hopes for constructive collaboration on Seoul's Indo-Pacific strategy and the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative. Marsudi, in response, welcomed efforts to further bolster joint ventures. On the local economic front, despite a dramatic decline in chip production last month, Korea marked improvements in industrial output, retail sales and facility investment. Our Moon Hae-ryun has the latest numbers.
Data released by Statistics Korea on Friday shows that the index for the country's overall industrial output in February stood at 109.4, up 0.3% on month. It's the second month in a row that industrial output has increased compared to the previous month. This was attributed to the rise in services, which rose by 0.7% overall, with the dining and accommodation sector, as well as the sports and leisure activities sector, showing the biggest growth since January.
Due to favorable weather and the slowing of the COVID-19 pandemic, all industrial production increased 0.3% a month due to growth in industries such as accommodation, food, art, sports and leisure.
However, output from the mineral and manufacturing industries fell by 3.2% on month due to a decline in semiconductor production, which slumped by more than 17% on month and over 41% compared to the same month last year. This is the greatest decline on month since December 2008. But the index for retail sales, a key gauge of consumer demand, saw a rise of 5.3% compared to the previous month, standing at 108.4 in February. The significant rise came following a consecutive three-month decline that began in November last year. Sales across all three sectors, measured by the agency, divided into durables, non-durables and semi-durable goods, saw a rise. In particular, department store and auto shop sales showed increases compared to January. Facility investment also rose by 0.2% on month due to continued investment in manufacturing facilities by companies amid growing expectations that semiconductor prices will improve in the second half of the year. Moon Hae-ryun, Arirang News.
On the local political front, the ruling party, the government and the presidential office on this Friday held a breakfast meeting to address plans to allow for flexible work hours. The ruling People Power Party says a survey will be conducted on 6,000 people for feedback before a new proposal is made. This follows the recent public backlash over an earlier government proposal for up to 69 hours of work per week from the current 52 hours. Participants also addressed utility bills, agreeing that a rise in electricity and gas prices is inevitable amid the operating deficits for KEPCO and the Korea Gas Corporation. More talks have been planned with regard to the size and timing of the price hikes. Seoul is rallying behind Busan's bid to host the 2030 World Expo. In fact, the capital city is hosting a special exhibition to showcase its support and more, just ahead of a planned visit by a delegation from the International Bureau of Expositions for an on-site inspection. Our culture correspondent Song Yoo-jin reports.
Blue roses, the symbol of hope and aspiration, light up Gwanghwamun Square in central Seoul. They're hoping that Busan, South Korea's second-largest city, becomes the venue for the 2030 World Expo, one of the three major international events along with the Olympics and the World Cup. In light of this, Gwanghwamun Square has gone through a complete makeover.
As the Bureau International d'Exposition, the organizer of the Expo, is visiting South Korea for a project examination, we planned this event to show people both at home and abroad Korea's dedication to the 2030 World Expo.
Here, you can take a look at the past and future of the World Expo. Yukjo-madang, the start of the square, tells the Expo's more than century-long history. Groundbreaking inventions like the telephone and the airplane were all introduced for the first time at past editions of the Expo. Next up, the three themes of the 2030 Busan World Expo. First, technology for humanity, like Korean motor giant Kia's new electric model, the EV9, is being showcased. Second, sustainable living with nature. You can enjoy some of SK Innovation's efforts to go green, like its fast-charging EV batteries. And a booth set up by Busan City where people can generate renewable energy by riding this bike inside. Finally, a platform for caring and sharing. Characters representing Lotte Group, Pelligom, Rotti, and Rori were there to greet visitors. There's also a wish tree filled with messages in support of Busan winning the bid. The 5-day exhibition gives some indication of Korea's ability to host the 2030 World Expo.
We were surprised because the place was packed with so many people. Just looking at this big crowd makes me confident that the 2030 World Expo is Busan's.
I'm very proud to be here seeing all these brands, and all these events are very exciting, all the photo booths, all the gifts that you're getting, and I hope Busan becomes the place for the Expo.
Now, hopes are high, and the excitement towards Busan's bid to host the 2030 World Expo is stronger than ever. Starting from here at Gwanghwamun Square, South Korea is showing that it's ready for the BIE's upcoming on-site inspection. 송유진, Arirang News.
Right, also here in the capital city, the 2023 Seoul Mobility Show is currently underway to share with the public the latest advances in the modes of future mobility with a focus on sustainability. Arirang's Jisoo was there.
Innovative electric SUVs, robots, and purpose-built vehicles. This year's Seoul Mobility Show is being held under the theme of sustainable, connected, and mobility. The 10-day event, which first began in 1995, changed its name from the Seoul Motor Show to the Seoul Mobility Show in 2021 to reflect the addition of new transportation modes, including urban air mobility and autonomous cars. Over 160 companies and organizations from 10 different countries are partaking in South Korea's largest motor show this year. One of the show's most anticipated reveals is none other than Kia's large electric SUV, the EV9, showcased to the public for the first time.
The EV9 strives to offer a user experience that goes beyond the means of transportation to create a life mobility space where families can bond and spend time together.
The EV9 SUV reflects Kia's intention to be more electric. The 3-row SUV also has second-row seats that can swivel 180 degrees to face the rear. Another company that garnered attention even before the event is KG Mobility, previously known as Sangyong Motors. This is KG Mobility's grand return after 4 years. The Taurus EVX is a mid-size electric SUV with distinctive features such as LED daytime running lights that enhances the visibility of the vehicle.
As for the horizontal daytime running lights, you can see the wideness from the front, as well as it also stands out because of its dotted form.
Also on display for the first time domestically are Hyundai Mobis's PBV M Vision 2 and M Vision High, which embodies the company's future strategy centered around urban mobility. Attendees can experience crab driving, where wheels can be rotated by 90 degrees, as well as 360-degree static turns.
The M Vision 2 was created as an urban mobility vehicle. The 90 and 360-degree rotations make it possible for people to parallel park and change directions easily in a limited space. You can think of it as a function that was specifically designed for the city.
A prototype of Tesla's humanoid robot Optimus is also on display for the first time in Korea.
These close looks into the present and future of mobility leaves no doubt that there is something for every car and tech enthusiast in the nation at the show. Jisoo, Arirang News.
On the diplomatic front, Turkey has taken a significant step forward in facilitating Finland's accession into NATO. The Turkish parliament voted in favor of Finland's membership on Thursday local time after Hungary did the same on Monday. Now, Finland is soon set to become the 74-year-old military alliance's 31st member. Separately, both Turkey and Hungary have yet to ratify Sweden's bid to enter NATO. Sweden and Finland applied to join NATO last May following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And speaking about Russia, a Wall Street Journal reporter has been arrested there on spying charges. Now, his arrest earlier on Thursday follows a similar charge against a Russian national in the U.S. last week who allegedly entered the country with fake documents to gather Russia-relevant information. Our Isung-jae has the latest.
In a move that will certainly further deteriorate relations between the United States and Russia, Russian authorities on Thursday announced that it had detained Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich. Russia's main security service, the FSB, said that the American journalist, who had been based in Moscow, has been trying to obtain state secrets. A Russian district court in Moscow said that he would be detained until May 29th. The arrest of Gershkovich marks the first time an American journalist has been detained by Russia over allegations of spying since the Cold War. However, the arrest also comes a week after U.S. authorities arrested a Russian national in the United States for allegedly spying. Despite speculation, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov did not say if Gershkovich's arrest was a retaliatory measure. In response to the arrest, the White House slammed Moscow, calling it unacceptable.
The State Department has also been in touch with the Wall Street Journal and his family on this matter. This espionage charges are ridiculous. The targeting of American citizens by Russian government is unacceptable. We condemn the detention of Mr. Gershkovich in the strongest terms. We also condemn the Russian government's continued targeting and repression of journalists.
The White House spokesperson also warned Americans against traveling to Russia, while also calling on any U.S. citizens living or currently visiting Russia to leave immediately. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
On the entertainment front, solo works released by members of big K-pop groups are proving to be very popular. Jimin from BTS released his first solo album, Face, only a week ago. And according to Hanteo chart on this Friday, it has sold over 1.45 million copies. It also broke the record as the best-selling album by a K-pop solo artist in the first week of its release. Meanwhile, Jisoo from BLACKPINK today released her first solo album called Me. And according to her record label, that is, YG Entertainment, total sales, including pre-orders, surpassed 1.24 million as of Thursday, that is, yesterday. Now, this is the highest ever figure by a K-pop female solo artist. On the cultural front, members of the media here back on Thursday were offered the rare chance to witness firsthand a wooden map of Chosun made by a Korean geologist back in the year 1861. My colleague Choi Soo-young was there and covers its relevance.
Daedongyeojido is regarded as the greatest map of Joseon dynasty. It means territorial map of the Great East, and was made using wooden blocks in 1861 by mapping specialist and geologist Kim Jung-ho. He created it based on the map named Donggyeojido that included all the roads, rivers, mountains, and even military bases, and over 18,000 names, as well as the history of the reasons from the Joseon period. There are 35 previous editions of Daedongyeojido, but a lot of information was omitted from them because it was hard to engrave on wood blocks one by one. Daedongyeojido consists of 23 separate and foldable booklets, including one volume with a table of contents. It divided the Korean Peninsula into 22 sections from north to south and is 8 meters wide and 5 meters long. When all 22 booklets are unfolded and laid together, it becomes an enormous-sized map of Korea. The Cultural Heritage Administration unveiled the 36th edition on Thursday morning to the press for the first time after its restitution from Japan. Its existence had passed into legend, but was confirmed for the first time in July 2022 when the former owner decided to sell. Experts assumed it was picked up during the Japanese colonial period by an obsessed European collector. Meanwhile, officials said this new edition is important because it was printed on paper first and added to using handwriting with almost all of the specific details. In the second volume, Baekdusan national boundary monuments mark the boundary between the Joseon and Qing dynasties. Moreover, in the 14th volume, a departure point can be seen for ships heading to Ulleungdo Island and the neighboring region. Shipping routes between Jeju Island and Jeollanam-do province are also outlined in the last volume. This new version of Daedongyeojido is very valuable as a means of showing what the Joseon dynasty's territory looked like before Japanese occupation. And it shows how the people of Joseon used Daedongyeojido.
You can see the meaning of the maps in Joseon society and how intelligently the maps were used through this new edition.
According to the officials, this new edition of Daedongyeojido will enhance interest in both the scientific cultural heritage of Joseon dynasty and inspire pride in Korean history. Choi Soo-young, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the Philippines, search and rescue efforts are ongoing following a deadly ferry fire. According to the latest reports, at least 31 people have been killed and 7 are missing after an inter-island ferry traveling from Zamboanga province to Jolo, Sulu province caught fire on Wednesday night local time. The fire started while most passengers were asleep. Over 220 of the total 250 passengers were rescued, with dozens jumping into the sea in a bid to escape the flames. Passengers were helped by the Coast Guard and local residents of the nearby Baluk Island. The cause of the fire is still being determined, but eyewitnesses report hearing explosions both before and after the blaze started. The Philippines has a record of maritime disasters due to aging vessels and overcrowding on ships. Turning over to the U.S. state of Kentucky now, where at least 9 U.S. service members have died following the crash of 2 U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopters. The crash occurred near Fort Campbell in the state's southwest during a routine training exercise that involved 4 helicopters on Wednesday evening local time. Now, reports say the 2 aircraft crashed into an open field and that there were no survivors. The helicopters were medical evacuation aircraft, part of the 101st Airborne Division. The cause of the crashes is still under investigation, and it's not known whether they collided with each other. The crash marks one of the deadliest training disasters for the U.S. military in recent times. Meanwhile, Major League Baseball's regular season kicked off on Thursday with new rules introduced which are meant to speed up games and introduce more action. And included in the changes is a first for the league, as games will now feature a pitch clock. Pitchers will now only be allowed 15 seconds to throw a pitch when bases are empty and 20 seconds if a base has a runner. And staying with bases, these have been enlarged from 38.1 centimeters to 45.7 centimeters. This is to accommodate the growing size of players over the years and to encourage more base steals, as well as to reduce injuries. And finally, researchers have found that plants can make noise. According to a study published in the science journal Cell on Thursday, plants make clicking and popping sounds that are not audible to the human ear. But using a special ultrasonic microphone, researchers have been able to capture what these noises sound like across a variety of plant types. Let's take a listen. Now, the finding shakes up previously held notions that the plant kingdom was mostly silent. Researchers also found that stressed plants make about 30 to 50 sounds per hour, while unstressed plants emit about 1 sound per hour. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. It feels more like the middle to end of May on this last day of March, with cherry blossoms already reaching near full bloom in the capital region. But of course, it's that very unwelcome fine dust that's causing headaches to those of us in the west of central regions and Gyeongsang-do provinces. And unfortunately, it does not look any better this weekend either. Wash hands frequently and drink plenty of water. And another reason to stay hydrated is due to the dry air. The dry weather advisory is expanding to more parts of the country. So when you are going hiking, fire safety is a must. Afternoon highs are 1 to 3 degrees higher than yesterday under sunny skies nationwide. And it's going to be even hotter this weekend with an expected peak above 25 degrees in the capital. And it also looks to be a very crowded weekend on the roads with that blossoms attracting crowds. That much hoped for rain is in the forecast for the first week of April. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
Right, that ends Friday's afternoon newscast. We have our panel session on the recent Summit for Democracy coming up next, so do stay tuned.
춥지 않은가요? 처음 태어난 이별에서 사는 우리 손잡아요.
한 번 이후엔
시작입니다. 스탠바이. 스타트.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
President Yoon Suk-yeol joined his counterparts from the US, Costa Rica, the Netherlands and Zambia to co-host the Summit for Democracy this week. The two-day virtual summit was the second of its kind, following its debut in 2021, including over 100 leaders invited by US President Joe Biden to address the state of democracy across the globe and ways to better promote it. So what was shared during the second summit? What are the current greatest risks to democracy? And what are the broader implications of this US-led initiative?
Welcome to Issues and Insiders. The second Summit for Democracy came to an end on Thursday, with US President Joe Biden painting a positive portrait, declaring that global leaders are turning the tide in disrupting a years-long decline in democracy. For more, I have Professor Robert Kelly at BUSAN National University live on the line. Professor Kelly, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Kwon Soa with us here in the studio. Soa, it's always good to have you here.
Happy to be here, Sunny.
Right, so let's begin with a few words then on this year's agenda, including, of course, President Yoon Suk-yeol's highlights, or what he chose to shed light on at this particular summit.
Right, Sunny. President Yoon, as the co-host of U.S. President Joe Biden's second Summit for Democracy, alongside Costa Rica, the Netherlands and Zambia, led the first leader-level plenary session on Wednesday virtually, which was focused on democracy's role in economic growth and shared prosperity. President Yoon, in his remarks, underlined that democracy, which was the key to freedom and prosperity over the past century, now is facing major challenges. President Yoon warned that in addition to the formation of authoritarian blocs that reject rules-based international order, fake democracy is spreading worldwide. With that, he called for solidarity among democratic states to embark on a new journey to revise the state of democracy. As part of the two-day event on Thursday, South Korea also hosted the Indo-Pacific meeting of the Second Summit for Democracy in Seoul, where ministerial-level officials and experts from Korea and the region focused on combating corruption, a key task in the fight for democracy. Now, meanwhile, South Korea's presidential office noted that it's meaningful the country took the lead in dealing with the global issue of a retreat in democracy by co-hosting the Second Summit for Democracy that brought together some 120 global leaders.
Right. Professor Kelly, President Yoon's pledge to promote democracy, it's been audible since his days on the campaign trail. And now pundits are saying it's time that his pledge takes more tangible form. That being said, what are your thoughts on ways for the Yoon administration to further advance democracy?
So I think the organizers, particularly the Americans, would like to see from the South Koreans on this a greater emphasis on things like human rights and democracy promotion in South Korean foreign policy, a little bit less emphasis on trade, particularly with dictatorships, and a little bit more emphasis on values. And this is something that the Yoon administration has pushed. As you mentioned, this is something that President Yoon wrote about in his foreign affairs essay a couple of years ago about sort of South Korea playing a greater role. This has been a part of this general discussion in South Korea about sort of being a responsible middle power and things like that. I also think a little bit more specifically, I think really sort of the backdrop for the summit is the Ukraine war. And I think that the Biden administration would really like it to look like the democratic world rather than just the West is standing behind Ukraine. And that means sort of non-Western democracies, Japan, South Korea, places like that. Their support on this is important too. And you know, the South Koreans were kind of here or there on this at the beginning, right? The Moon Jae-in administration was very mixed in its response to the Ukraine war, and Yoon Suk-yeol has been much more sort of aggressive in that support. And so I think those are really the two issues here, right, regarding South Korea, Ukraine, and a general kind of integration of democracy and its promotion into South Korean foreign policy initiatives.
And staying with that, Professor Kelly, personally, do you suppose that the Yoon administration can perhaps afford to do a bit more with regard to supporting the global cause for peace in Ukraine?
I do. I mean, South Korea's got a really good defense industry. I mean, this is pretty established now. I think South Korea is like the world's fourth or fifth largest weapons exporter. It's been a very controversial debate in South Korea about whether or not South Korea should provide arms directly to Ukraine. I would argue that South Korea should do that. I think it would be good generally for the cause of democracy. Certainly, I think South Korea has the wealth and the budget to do that. I mean, it's not really, the real threat from North Korea is like nuclear weapons. And so the provision of things like, tanks and bullets and those kinds of things are less important, I think, for South Korea than missile defense. So to the extent that the South Korean defense industry is producing a wide plethora of goods, I think South Korea could probably do more on that. And then I think the South Koreans could also talk more. If you read South Korean sort of diplomatic white papers, democracy is sort of in there, but it's not often hyped and pushed as much as, say, for example, a cultural agenda of like K-pop and stuff like that. And I think that the South Koreans could do that too. And again, I think the Yoon government's very sympathetic to that, right? I think the Yoon government liked being invited to sort of speak on this and organize these panels, and it got sort of hyped in the media here. So, and I think the potential is there for cooperation on this.
Right. Meanwhile, so researchers, they've been claiming that democracy has been on a decline across the globe in recent years. What more, that is, can you share with us based on findings, I believe, for last year, is it?
Yes, Sunny, it appears there are more countries in the world that are moving toward authoritarianism than there are countries that are moving toward democracy. An annual report published by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, in short, IDEA, in November last year, found democracy in 2022 has weakened significantly. It said this was true for half of democratic governments worldwide, while authoritarian governments were intensifying their repression. Referring to countries that are suffering democratic erosion as backsliding countries, the report saw this happening even in places that are credited for being highly established democracies, including the U.S., which along with India and Mauritius showed moderate backsliding from democracy, while Hungary, Poland, Brazil, and El Salvador showed severe backsliding. Almost half of all democracies in Europe were found to have been suffering erosion in the past 5 years. The study looks into more than 100 variables to measure the global state of democracy, and according to the report, the decline in democracy was attributed to problems like political polarization, institutional dysfunction, distrust in the legitimacy of elections, threats to civil liberties, such as restrictions on freedom of expression, the rise of far-right parties, and more. Why are these issues getting worse? It's because of unprecedented global challenges. The study says leaders are faced with difficulties brought on by Russia's war in Ukraine, rising costs of living expenses, inflation, a looming global recession, nuclear confrontation, COVID-19, as well as climate change. There were also some positive developments noted in some regions in Africa, for instance, which maintained resilience despite of these global issues. Democracies in the Gambia, Niger, and Zambia improved, and according to the study, South Korea's democracy was assessed as having expanded significantly, and apart from China, East Asia remained predominantly democratic.
Right, I see. And Professor Kelly, what do you believe are among perhaps the biggest threats to democracy as we speak?
I think really sort of two. There are external threats, which I think most of us now sort of fully understand, right? I mean, it's pretty clear after the Ukraine war that the Russians at least have a pretty aggressive agenda for territorial revision in Europe, sort of undoing the Cold War settlement, and also ensuring that the states around Russia are not democratic, that they are in some way corrupted, or pseudo-democratic states like Belarus, where they pretend to have elections, but the same guy wins again and again and again. You have political parties, but they're all co-opted by the government. I mean, that's a real threat, right? And your report there just discussed this a little bit, right? I mean, this is a growing problem that we've noted in political science for a while, the emergence of sort of electoral autocracies, if you want to call them, like Orban's Hungary or something like that, right? Where you have elections and create some like strongman figure, and he's basically unconstrained by the courts, right? Political parties are corrupted, press freedoms are repressed. So there's that kind of internal challenge. And I would also point out, as an American, I feel obliged to say that, I mean, the Donald Trump is pushed in this direction too, right? With the assault on the U.S. Congress and everything else. So that's sort of the internal threat. And then the external threat is particularly Russia, right? Particularly Russia's desire to revise or change the settlement in Eastern Europe. It looks like Putin's interest in that is fairly substantial, right? That he doesn't just want to change sort of a little bit here and there in like Georgia or something like that, but really wants to sort of roll back a lot of what's happened in the last 25 years. And then also, of course, China, right, which has been significantly more belligerent in East Asia under this leader, under this current president, Xi Jinping, right? There's been a significant ramp up in China's use of economic leverage against opponents. The Philippines, Vietnam, South Korea, Australia have all kind of felt Chinese pressure, and that too is a threat on their democratic processes because it's sort of preempting them via external pressure.
Right, and speaking about those two countries, Russia and China, as mentioned by Professor Kelly, so as was the case during the first summit, these two countries have been excluded from the second summit for democracy, and the response from these two countries, of course, was quite harsh, right?
Right, Sunny. Just as they have been excluded, also just like around the first summit of democracy, China and Russia have been trying to undermine the meeting in advance through media outlets and also through high-profile figures. So let's start with Russia. Russian ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, denounced the second summit for democracy by laying out what he called flaws of the first summit, citing participants there. Speaking to the American weekly Newsweek, Antonov called the first conference an epitome of hypocrisy, adding this thought was even shared by a number of observers in the West. He criticized Washington's selection of invitees, suggesting some of them are deemed undemocratic, and said questions came up on the U.S.'s moral right to push its interests throughout the world, while the country faces its own serious problems at home, such as political and socio-economic issues. Also, the envoy claimed that the organizers of the summit have been encouraging participants to incorporate anti-Russian language in the joint final declaration, and that they are trying to form a human rights coalition against Moscow under the cover of enhancing democracy. Antonov said, quote, "It is extremely dangerous to cultivate in people the idea of their exclusivity regardless of the motive." Now, dangerous was also a word that appeared in an op-ed of the China Daily, which shared the view of three experts and accused the United States of reflecting a dangerous Cold War mentality by hosting the Summit for Democracy. It said rather than promoting democracy, the summit would lead to conflicts and political divisions among the international community. According to the opinion piece, some Western countries' aim is to kidnap democracy in a bid to manipulate the rest of the world. So basically, both China and Russia are trying to convey to the world that the Summit for Democracy is not really about democracy and are describing it as hypocritical.
Right, and Professor Kelly, what are your personal thoughts regarding these stances shared by Russia and China with regard, of course, to US-led efforts on democracy?
Yeah, I think it's pretty predictable, right? I mean, both countries are, I would argue, a pseudo-democracy, which is to say they have sort of fake elections and then, right, you basically have a dictatorship, right? Putin has really kind of promoted this model. He sort of coined it really sort of in his own image, right? I mean, the Constitution of Russia has been revised multiple times in order to allow him to run again. Presidential terms there have been reelected, have been extended, right? He manipulated the prime ministership when someone else sort of took his place as president and then he came back. I mean, it's not really a democracy at all, right? And China, of course, sort of has the same kinds of issues, not as directly, right? But you still have sort of what are supposedly elections inside the Chinese Communist Party, but of course they're really not, and Xi will never leave power, right? I mean, in democracies, at some point, the guy at the top leaves, and Xi's made it very clear he's not going to. So both countries, though, I think the leaderships in both countries are aware, though, of the kind of normative or moral weight that democracy carries around the world. That is that sort of people out there in the world, particularly since the Cold War ended, expect democracy or see it as sort of like the normal state of affairs, right? I mean, Marxism is no longer a serious challenge. Fascism is no longer a serious ideological challenge, right? I mean, the world kind of expects democracy. So autocracies have to mimic the language of democracy. And the Russians particularly have been very, very good at this, right? But the Chinese do it too, right? And so a lot of this is designed to create sort of like fuzziness about what does democracy really mean, right? Sort of get away from the idea that democracy means fair elections, multiple parties. These are the kinds of things the Russians and the Chinese don't have. And so they cover that up by talking about like U.S. imperialism as like, like a democratic fraud and things like that. But all of that kind of changes the subject from the core issue, which is democratic institutions. Do you have a free press? Do you have multiple political parties? Do you have secret ballot elections? And the Chinese and Russians don't have that.
Right. Professor Kelly, critics have pointed out that, and I quote, American democracy is hardly a model for others. Yeah. And as So has mentioned, they've also taken issue with the list of invitees itself, which includes some countries that they claim where democracy, of course, has been dismissed in these countries, but they have been invited to these talks. But supporters of the Summit for Democracy, nonetheless, insist it's better than nothing. What do you say, Professor Kelly?
Yeah, better than nothing is a good way to put it, I suppose. I mean, I do believe that there is a growing, first of all, we know, in political science, we have sort of like measures of democratization in the world. And there's been a large discussion mentioned there by, your reporter as well, there's been a large discussion for a long time that democracy is backsliding. I mean, this is a known element, and I think the Biden administration are genuinely concerned about that because democracies get along well, they don't fight wars against each other, they have better relations with one another than they do with non-democracies. Trade is better, there's more trust. I mean, democracy is sort of good for world politics in many ways, and the backsliding is bad. And I think the Biden people are aware of that, right? And I think they really want to draw a contrast with Donald Trump, who just didn't care about this stuff, right? Donald Trump came to Korea and he said, I like North Korea more than South Korea, which kind of scared everybody, right? And so I think the argument is then what the Biden people are trying to do with these summits is they're trying to sort of bring back a sense of like values and some kind of like idealism to U.S. foreign policy, right? That we're trying to sort of like make the world a better place. This isn't just the kind of like transactional foreign policy you saw under Donald Trump, because that's what the Chinese and the Russians do, right? Where it's all just about national interest. It's not about values. It's not about human rights. And, you know, as you mentioned, the United States could do a lot better on that too, right? I mean, that's also one of the problems with the Trump presidency, right? Is President Trump kind of turned into an authoritarian and, you know, sort of tried to overthrow the U.S. government in 2021. So, yeah, I mean, we're not exactly in a good position to say this, but it doesn't mean that but it doesn't mean that the values are wrong, right? And, you know, so I give Biden some credit for that. Like you said, better than nothing.
Right. Moving forward, so Pakistan has chosen to decline yet again U.S. invitation to partake in the Summit for Democracy, right?
Right, Sunny. Pakistan said, thank you for the invitation, but no thank you. Now, in a decline in its statement by the country's foreign ministry, it did not really give a specific reason for why it is skipping the summit, but it was not the first time, as it did not attend the first summit either. Now, Pakistan expressed its thanks to the U.S. and highlighted the country's friendship with Washington, saying under the current administration led by Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and the U.S.'s Biden administration, ties have widened and expanded substantially. Back in 2021, there was actually greater reason to not attend the summit as tensions were growing between the then Prime Minister Imran Khan, who was later ousted, and the Biden administration. So the statement said Pakistan remains committed to, quote, further solidifying this relationship for peace, stability, and prosperity in the region, and vowed it will engage bilaterally with Washington as well as the co-hosts of the summit instead of attending. Now, there are a number of reasons that experts name for the South Asian country having skipped the occasion. For one, it's in consideration of its longtime ally China, and the second reason, big reason, being turmoil in its own country. So despite Islamabad highlighting its wish to solidifying relations with Washington, more of that could be seen between Pakistan and China, the latter one, of course, not on the good side with the U.S. So Pakistan and China have cemented economic and defense ties in recent years, with Beijing having made significant investments in its South Asian neighbor, in particular under the Belt and Road Initiative, which is road, power plants, and ports constructions projects. And another reason that observers name is that Pakistan is ranked as one of the worst democracies in the world and just hasn't much to provide at the Summit for Democracy, in particular amid growing instability and turmoil surrounding a continuous crackdown on former Prime Minister Khan and his political party. And one expert put it this way. He described it in the way saying, what would I have it right here. What would you present there if you go to participate in the summit about democracy and democratic values? Again, because Pakistan is ranked as one of the worst democracies.
Right. Professor Kelly, the issue of human rights was also on the agenda. And even prior to the start of the summit, President Yoon Suk-yeol denounced North Korea's appalling abuses and, of course, its nuclear weapons ambitions, adding that not a single one will be sent to the regime given this particular reality. What look to be the broader implications of this tough North Korea policy, if I may, Professor Kelly?
Sure. I think the Yoon administration shares the beliefs of the United States, a lot of Western countries, and Japan, that North Korea is probably never going to denuclearize, and negotiating with North Korea, which the Moon government tried for 5 years in some cooperation with the Trump government in the United States, that just didn't work, right? That Kim Jong-un sort of had his chance. He had a window of 3 or 4 years where both Moon Jae-in and Donald Trump, the leader of the two big countries, the leaders of the two big countries with which North Korea has trouble, the Americans and South Koreans, both of those leaders wanted a deal. Both of those leaders were willing to meet and did meet several times, and the North Koreans basically offered Very little, almost nothing, to be honest. At Hanoi, really, in 2019, it was the only offer they made, and it was very unbalanced. And I think the consensus, certainly, I think inside the Yoon administration, is that North Korea proved in that period that it just wasn't really serious about negotiating. It wasn't really interested in a fair deal, and that it's sort of here to stay as a nuclear power. And therefore, we need to take stronger steps to curb that, right? I mean, South Korea is really vulnerable to North Korean missile strikes, and anything that sort of helps the North Korean economy grow, helps the North Korean economy operate better, helps the North Koreans build more of these weapons. And I think that's what the Yoon government is pushing for. I would just add on this only too that South Korea is very polarized, I think, between right and left, between conservatives and progressives on this. And you can really see the swing in South Korean foreign policy as sort of South Korea moves from the leftist presidency of Moon Jae-in, who was all about engagement and détente, and then whoosh, you kind of swing to confrontation. That's very sort of characteristic, I think, of South Korea's deep divide on how to approach North Korea.
Right. Well, the Yoon administration is, of course, going to continue to put North Korea on the global debate table. And that being said, so I understand South Korea will be hosting the third Summit for Democracy. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So on the occasion of the second Summit for Democracy, President Yoon expressed his anticipation for the third Summit for Democracy, which, as I said, will be hosted by South Korea, as he vowed to promote freedom, human rights, and the rule of law as the next host of the event. And Seoul's agreement to be the host of the third Summit for Democracy has been welcomed by the U.S., which actually broke the news ahead of the second summit. And in a joint statement on Wednesday, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol and his U.S. counterpart, President Biden, announced that South Korea indeed will actually host a future third summit, which reflects the two allies, what the two allies have been working on together, stressing common democratic values and respect for human rights, as well as the commitment to further strengthen political, economic, security, and people-to-people ties. Now, what's not known yet is whether South Korea will solely host this next event, or whether it will do that with the U.S., or whether we will have co-hosts again, as we had this time, where we had the U.S. leading the summit, but with 5 other co-hosts. So that we don't know yet.
Right. I suppose we'll have to wait and see then. All right. So thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Kelly over in Busan, as always, thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you for having me.
Right, well, on that note, we say goodbye. We'll be back same time next Monday with a look at the cost of living here amid rising prices. Join us then. Have a good weekend.
Various plants grow in an ordinary city. Many flowers bloom where they stay at. Beautiful butterflies and migratory birds visit this place, a place where the city and the garden become together as one. This place is the ecological capital of Korea, Suncheon. We live in the garden.
Every view, a breathtaking one. Every stroll, a happy one. Every thought, a thrilling one. Suncheon, the spectacular one. #1 national garden. Become a global #1 eco-city. Good to great change. Suncheonman International Garden Expo.